Welcome back to the West London Witch. This episode contains references to child abuse, murder, suicide, domestic violence, and bestiality. Listener discretion is strongly advised. The term satanic panic gets bandied about quite liberally these days. Most of us have a passing understanding of the moral craze that swept over the world in the 1980s. An irrational fear of devil-worshipping, satanic, and ritual abuse seeped into every corner of society. Satanists were sacrificing babies in preschools. The devil was being summoned by teens playing Dungeons and Dragons. Rock music was Satan's siren song. And major corporations like Procter & Gamble were connected to the Church of Satan. Okay, that one's not too unbelievable. But all joking aside, we now may look back at the satanic panic as an insane, paranoid witch hunt. But this moral panic was a very real problem that had very real consequences and ruined real people's lives forever. It is often reported that the catalyst for the satanic panic was the 1980 book, Michelle Remembers. The book was written by Canadian Michelle Smith and her psychiatrist, Lawrence Pastor. The book recounts the journey that Michelle and Pastor undertook to unlock her repressed memories of satanic ritual abuse. Through Michelle's recovered memory therapy, she remembered that at the age of 5, her mother and members of a satanic organization savagely and brutally abused and tortured her. The book is full of elaborate and disturbing descriptions of satanic rituals, human sacrifices, sexual assault, dismemberment of babies, and endless rituals involving blood and butchered body parts. It's horrendous. And the book was an instant success. Michelle and Pastor took to the talk show circuit to share Michelle's story, and everyone from Sally Jessy Raphael to Geraldo Rivera gave validity and airtime to Michelle's experience. Other survivors of ritual abuse came flooding out of the woodwork. People were remembering their satanic abuse at alarming rates, and psychiatrists were there to help them along the way. Michelle Remembers primed the world for other dark encounters with Satan, such as the McMartin preschool case. In 1983, members of the McMartin family and teachers at their daycare center were charged with hundreds of counts of sexual abuse against children attending their school. They were accused of being a part of a satanic group that sacrificed babies and animals, had secret tunnels underneath the preschool where they committed these alleged satanic attacks, flushed children down toilets to abuse them and then cleaned them up so their parents would never know. They flew through the air like witches and also took children away in hot air balloons. Hundreds of children were interviewed in connection to this case. It is now understood that the techniques employed in their interviews were not only highly suggestive, but totally unethical. When this case went to trial, Lawrence Pastor and Michelle Smith were consulted as experts on satanic abuse. The problem was, Michelle was lying. Michelle Remembers was not a memoir, but rather a work of fiction. Michelle hadn't been stolen away at the age of 5 and abused. She was at school, happy and healthy. This was confirmed by her sisters, her teachers, and even the school yearbook. Michelle Smith and Lawrence Pastor had an extremely inappropriate doctor-patient relationship, with the two of them even divorcing their spouses and eventually marrying each other. But by the time the book had been discredited, the damages had already been done. In 1990, after 3 years of various trials, the McMartin daycare case was dismissed, and all of the charges were dropped. But the family had been ruined and had suffered their own very real abuse at the hands of the media and the court of public opinion. This case was, and still is, the longest and most expensive series of criminal trials to ever have been prosecuted in the United States of America. Although this case is one of the most notable, it wasn't alone. Satan was everywhere, and he was reshaping the way we saw the world around us. Although Michelle Remembers is seen as the initial flame that spread the wildfire of satanic panic across the globe, I'd argue it was more of the spark that lit the pre-prepared bonfire. From the witch trials of the 15th to 18th century, to the rise of spiritualism in the 19th century, to the popularity of satanic-themed works like The Exorcist, The Omen, and my personal favorite, Rosemary's Baby, in the late 1960s to the 1970s, to the rash of serial killers and cults that flourished post-Vietnam War, to the rise of the Church of Satan in 1966. The world was already moving towards a fascination of the devil. Now that fascination had been given the permission to evolve into fear. Hey friends, it's Becca. For the past 3 years, the West London Witch team have been dedicated to bringing you the best supernatural stories at the highest studio quality. And by team, I mean me and my buddy Danny. We do this work totally for free because we love it. We're proud of our content and appreciate the wonderful interactions we get to have with storytellers and listeners just like yourself. If you're enjoying the West London Witch, maybe consider joining our Patreon. It's a way to further engage with us and show your support for two creatives. If you're in a position to spare enough each month for us to grab a cup of coffee in between edits or add to the piggy bank for a new microphone, we would love to see you in our Patreon community. But I know times are tough, so if you're not in a position to join Patreon right now, that's okay. We aren't going anywhere. Head on over to patreon.com/The West London Witch. For as little as £1, $1, €1 a month, you can gain full access to our coven, a space where we share behind-the-scenes stories, dive deeper into each episode, answer your questions, and have special little treats to thank you for sharing your love and kindness with your favorite little witch. Hello, and welcome to episode 66 of The West London Witch, a podcast where we share stories about those moments where we find ourselves very much not alone. This season of The West London Witch, we have seemed to have fallen deep into our Satan era, if you will. We have covered everything from Roland Doe to the Devil Made Me Do It case. And legendary paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren have featured in many of our episodes this season. The Warrens have passed, but their work lives on through their grandson, Chris McKinnell. Chris runs a foundation known as the Warren Legacy and is still working towards his grandparents' goal of helping those afflicted by the paranormal. Today, Chris shares with us the story of two mirror cases that changed him fundamentally as a paranormal researcher. I'm Rebecca Strazina, and this is The West London Witch, episode 66, The Warren Legacy.
So let me tell you about the case of Maurice Thierry. If you've all seen The Nun, There's a character known as Frenchie, and Frenchie doesn't really exist. Matter of fact, the nun doesn't exist. That is pure Hollywood fantasy. There's nothing real about that movie except in the credits. In the credits, you will see the exorcism, or some of the exorcism, of Maurice Theriault. This case had a profound impact on me, to the point where it changed everything I do in this work.
In 1984, while Chris was studying at university, he got a phone call from his grandparents, Ed and Lorraine Warren, asking for his help with a new case.
And said, all right, we got a case up in Warren, Massachusetts. It's a farmer. He claims that he's being attacked. Words are being scratched into his back in French. And Maurice was a French Canadian. He was the only one that could speak French, but he was also illiterate. He couldn't read at all. So he would have his family read these words to him, and then he would translate them for his family. Things were moving around the house. There was a beautiful, ornate Arab coffee set with these tiny little cups on a beautiful metal platter. And somehow it ended up teleported above the curtain rod, resting on the curtain rod on an odd angle. So it wasn't even well balanced. It was physically impossible, as in physics could not explain this, and yet it stayed there. And he was having this apparition come to him. It was a woman in white when he was plowing in the fields and warning him that something was coming.
Progressively, Maurice was sustaining more and more injuries and pain. His suffering was unbearable, and his wife Nancy had grown fearful of him. Finally, it all became too much for her. Out of fear and desperation, she called the Warrens for help.
The day we went there, the first day, I brought my partner with me, a young man named Ray Jefferson, who happened to live in the same dorm room with me at the University of Connecticut. And we watched this interview as Maurice talked about how his father was a monster. As a child, he would be beaten by his father, tortured, abused. This is rather rated X, but one time he walked in on his father having sex with a farm animal, and his father made him do the same so that he wouldn't tell his mother.
After hearing all about the horrendous abuse Maurice suffered at the hands of his father, Ed Warren wondered if this activity could be connected to Maurice's dad.
And he asked Maurice, so what exactly happened to your dad? So, well, one day, my dad called me. And he said, Maurice, I just want you to know I love you. It was the only time he had ever told Maurice that he loved him. And then he put the phone down, and while Maurice continued to listen, he walked into the next room, picked up a gun, killed Maurice's mother, and then killed himself. Well, Maurice listened.
It was obvious to the Warrens that Maurice was suffering with PTSD and trauma. Ed had an idea of how they could help rid Maurice from the clutches of his dead father.
My grandfather thought, all right, if it's the father causing this problem, then let's go to his grave. And Maurice, I want you to tell your dad that you forgive him and that you love him. And while we stood there, and I was standing probably about 5 meters away, 15 feet away from him, Maurice was right in front of the grave. I was off to Maurice's left and in back. And Maurice is crying and telling his dad he loves him and he forgives him. Maurice got punched so hard under the chin, it knocked him through the air and about 3 meters backward, flat on his back. You could hear the punch.
This was the 1980s, and Ed was heavily subscribing to the satanic panic. Demons and spiritual attack were around every corner. Any force this powerful surely had to be demonic.
I still had my doubts, and still do to this day. As a matter of fact, even more today. But we'll get to that.
Convinced that Maurice was suffering from a demonic attack, Ed instructed Chris and Ray to alternate staying at the home with the family so they could record and document any and all spiritual activity. If they wanted the church to get involved, they would need a trove of indisputable evidence.
In my time with them, I was also going back and forth to another case in Tewksbury, Massachusetts, which was a poltergeist case. In this particular case, the children were out of control. There was a lot of infighting. The father was already out of the house. A parapsychology team had already been in the house, and somehow this story then ended up in the newspaper. The day we arrived, my partner and I, Ray, the whole neighborhood was crowded with maybe 300 cars, all people begging us to let them into this haunted house to see it. It's like, are you out of your minds? Get out of here. Go away. This is one of the main points of contention I had with my grandfather, was this publicity. Now, this particular case wasn't my grandfather's fault. This was somebody else that had put it in the paper, but they publicized their cases. And in hindsight, I understand that it was before the movies, before internet. They really didn't have another way to get their name out there. They had worked in anonymity for over 20 years. And being known meant that they were actually more effective and able to help more people. I get that now. Luckily, we've got the internet now, and I can do these things instead. And we don't have to publicize our cases, and we never do. The other reason I'm talking about these is because they're already in the public record.
Once Chris was in the house in Tewksbury, he could feel the chaos and tension. The energy was electric and palpable. Chris was studying psychology at university, and he was convinced there could be a link between the paranormal and the human mind.
100 families can come in and out of a home and never have a problem. Millions of people use Ouija boards and never have a problem. But then there's that one person who's very vulnerable or suicidal or depressed. And like my grandmother would say, like attracts like. If you're putting out negative energy, you're going to attract something negative. And that's what I see in these cases. When we work on these cases, we always deal with them holistically. We always try to treat everything. But this was not something we understood very well back then, unfortunately. Tragically. In the case in Tewksbury, this continued exactly as long as my involvement with Maurice Theriault. They both were sort of resolved on the same day. When I was with Maurice and he would come under possession, and he did come under possession, his eyes would take on the look of a snake. He would bleed tears of blood. He would drool blood.
One afternoon during the spring of 1985, Chris, Ray, Maurice, and his wife Nancy were all in the greenhouse of the couple's home planting seedlings.
And Maurice was complaining he was feeling cold. I said, well, yeah, it's chilly. Why don't you head on over to the wood stove and get warmed up? Because that was in the back of the greenhouse. And then Ray says to me, Chris, look at Maurice. He's not moving. And Maurice was just standing there looking at me, staring at me with those slit eyes again. I said, all right, Ray, get Nancy up to the house quickly. And I went toward Maurice, making the sign of the cross in front of me and saying, by the power of Jesus Christ, I command you to be gone, again and again, with complete conviction. And after some time, honestly, in these kind of situations, you never know exactly how much time has passed. Was it a minute? Was it several seconds? Was it 5 minutes? I honestly couldn't tell. But he came out of it. But then he was complaining that his back still felt cold. So, well, let me take a look. So I pulled up his shirt. And on his t-shirt, in blood, soaked through his t-shirt, were 3 crosses. When I lifted up his t-shirt, though, There was blood on his back, but there were no cuts.
Chris was dumbfounded. Where had this blood come from? He instructed Maurice to remove his shirt. He wanted to take it back to the university to be tested. Was this human blood?
And he took off the shirt in front of me. He handed it to me. There was no blood on it. There was still blood on his back, but the blood on the shirt, the white t-shirt, was gone. We have a photo of it. It's in the first edition of Satan's Harvest, the book about this.
This incident pushed the case to the next level. It was time a higher power got involved. After confronting the church with the wealth of evidence the team had collected, Bishop McKinnell came onto the scene to help Maurice and his wife rid themselves of the evil that plagued them.
One of the holiest men I've ever met in my entire life. Now, I'm not a Christian anymore. I've traveled all around the world. And I've learned that God doesn't care what your religion is. He cares about your faith, your empathy, and your compassion. And he'll answer your prayers if they're sincere and they're backed by faith. I think that's important for people to understand. Every religion has their own way of dealing with the paranormal. But we always try to work with the religion of the family we're dealing with.
In these two cases, both families had a belief in Christ. Maurice was Catholic, and the family in Tewksbury were non-denominational Christian. So the team are going to approach both of these cases from a Christian approach.
So the day that everything was supposed to take place, Ray and I and the other two researchers and my grandparents all got together, and we went to Tewksbury, Massachusetts first to deal with this poltergeist case. Bishop McKinnell went through the whole house, did a complete cleansing. Everything settled down for 2 years. Then we went to Maurice's. I'll never, ever forget. My grandfather started complaining that he didn't feel right. He didn't feel well. And my grandmother saying to him, "Ed, you're probably low on potassium. Have a banana." Actually, he was having his first heart attack, just as the exorcism of Maurice Theriault was starting to take place.
If you watch the closing credits of the movie The Nun, you can actually see footage of Maurice's exorcism. What you may not have known was at the time of that very moment, Ed Warren was also experiencing his own personal hell as he endured his first cardiac event.
Ray was behind Maurice with the other two guys, and I was standing in front of Maurice to block him from getting at the Archbishop. I was the biggest. Maurice started rocking back and forth in his chair and drooling blood. He was in tremendous pain in his belly. As the exorcism progressed, he came under full possession. He was bleeding from the eyes. He had drooled blood on his white t-shirt. And in the video, what the video picked up that we couldn't see with our naked eye were those slit eyes again, and a crack appearing, I think it was the left side of his head. And then these scaly cheeks, almost like a snake. We couldn't see that with our naked eye.
Chris has had this video extensively tested. The tape has been confirmed not to have been altered or tampered with in any way. But experts from all over the world cannot explain the phenomenon it captured.
So the video was actually picking up a psychic image of this thing that we couldn't see with our naked eyes. Bishop McKinnell demanded, "Demon, tell me your name. In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you, tell me your name." And the thing said, "I am what I am," which is exactly what God said to Moses in the burning bush. It's just a form of blasphemy that upsets Christians, gets them off balance. It's the same thing we saw those 3 crosses on his back. It was another insult to the Trinity and to the crucifixion. Bishop McKenna was able to expel the spirit from Maurice. 2 years later, though, I was still in touch with the family in Tewksbury, had kind of lost touch with Maurice and his wife. They hadn't had problems for quite a while, but they also didn't get any help for all of the trauma that he had gone through. So he was still dealing with those underlying vulnerabilities that I had talked about. When I visited the home in Tewksbury, they hadn't had any activity for 2 years.
Chris was delighted that the family in Tewksbury had been activity-free. He had grown close to them while working on their case. The family had invited Chris and his cousin to stay the night in their poltergeist-free home.
Being the gentlemen that we are, we took the 10-year-old's bed and had him sleeping on the floor in a sleeping bag while we slept in sleeping bags on his bed. Nice guys. I was young. I was an idiot. I apologize. And then my cousin starts complaining that I'm kicking the bed. I'm like, John, I'm not kicking the bed. Look, I'm still in my sleeping bag. Okay, Chris, cut it out. Turn off the light again. Chris, stop kicking the bed. At that moment, the bed lifted off the ground, flew 10 feet across the room, slammed down, and broke into pieces. I was laughing so hard because I thought, this is the most incredible thing I have ever had happen to me in my entire life. I just flew. Well, I thought I flew. John, on the other hand, he flew out the door, down the stairs as quick as he could. He was scared to death. He got to the kitchen, and the woman of the house, her name actually was Lorraine, just like my grandmother. She was sitting there having a coffee and a cigarette with her back to us. She turns around, looks at John, and she says, "So, you believe me now?"
John and Chris did believe the family. So much so that Chris's cousin John packed up and left and never made it through the night. Chris, on the other hand, saw this experience as a formative learning moment.
That taught me that all of that turmoil that I had mentioned between the children, all of the things these kids were going through, they were manifesting the spirits. And I realized after that bed flew across the room with us in it, that 10-year-old had tapped into the energy that was still in the home, that had been dormant for 2 years. And he was pissed off that he got to sleep on the floor while we were in his bed. And that was the only incident that ever took place in that house after the spiritual cleansing, was that one night. It taught me how powerful our minds can be.
It is important to note that after Bishop McKenna blessed the house in Tewksbury, the work for the family wasn't over. The house had been cleansed and the activity had stopped, but the family worked hard to keep up that happy, energetic equilibrium. They got help for their children's behavioral troubles and emotional challenges. Every day, they chose light. They chose to work as a family, to not let outside forces pull them apart. And it worked. Other than this one incident with the bed, the family never had issues after the cleansing. It wasn't magic. It was hard work. But it was work worth doing. However, at the same time as the Tewksbury family moving forwards and upwards with their lives, Maurice was spiraling in his.
Maurice didn't get the help he needed. And 2 years later, while I'm still visiting my friends in Tewksbury, he started to come under attack. He started to slip again. Nancy had had enough. She couldn't deal with it anymore. She got a restraining order, had him thrown out of the house. One night, as she was coming home from work, she was getting out of her car, and Maurice was waiting for her. And he blew her arm off with a shotgun dragged her bleeding into the kitchen. And while she waited for him to kill her, just as his father had killed his mother, at the last moment, Maurice turned the shotgun on himself and blew his head off in front of her.
The news of Maurice's tragic demise had an extreme impact on Chris and his relationship to the paranormal. He had always enjoyed working with his grandparents to help those in need. But what he learned from these two cases was that God helps those who help themselves. It's not enough to cleanse a house and walk away. The afflicted need to continue to work on keeping the demons at bay, whether they be metaphorical or literal.
The paranormal is not a hobby. It's not tourism. It is a serious field of research with real lives at stake. People shouldn't treat it lightly. You shouldn't be running around trying to contact spirits when you have no idea what you might be contacting. If you're in the wrong frame of mind, you can attract something you really don't want in your life.
Maurice was definitely under some sort of attack. But was it spiritual, mental, demonic, or a combination thereof? We won't ever truly know. But with the satanic panic in the 1970s and 80s running rampant in the cultural and societal zeitgeist at the time, Ed and Lorraine Warren's lenses were definitely tinted to the shade of Satan. The Warrens have been heavily criticized for constantly crying demon when there could have been another explanation. Not everything in the world of the paranormal is tied directly to the devil.
It took a long time for my grandfather to see that. He did eventually. I caution people when they look at these old videos of my grandparents talking. Remember, you're seeing a snapshot in time of them. You're not seeing where they ended up. Theirs was a journey that went from their childhood up until their 80s. And they learned an awful lot in that time, and they changed their views constantly, just as I had. I used to believe in demons. I don't anymore. Because one of the things I've learned in my travels all around the world, from Africa to Asia to South America and Europe and the Middle East, these things manifest according to your cultural and spiritual beliefs. That was the most impactful story, most impactful case that I've ever worked on. And I appreciate you letting me share with you this evening.
Chris fully and openly accepts that his grandparents, Ed and Lorraine, were not perfect people. He disagrees with some of their methodologies, approaches, and their relationship to fame and the media. But he does value their desire to help people in need. Something I had not considered before speaking with Chris is that his grandparents didn't start off famous. They began as humble folks helping those who were experiencing extreme phenomenon. For better or for worse, fame did find them and change their lives in immeasurable and unbelievable ways. They are the #1 most famous paranormal investigators of all time. But Chris doesn't want their legacy just to be dramatized retellings of their most explosive cases or 30 cringy movies based off of the Amityville horror. He wants their memory to live on in an active fashion. The Warren legacy is a foundation created by Chris and his grandmother, Lorraine. It's a network where experts from all over the globe can help those who are suffering from the paranormal. In their own words, we are a non-denominational organization now dedicated to continuing the work of legendary paranormal investigators, Ed and Lorraine Warren. If you'd like to learn more about the foundation, head on over to warrenlegacyfoundation.com. From there, you can find links to their Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and TikTok. If you head on over to the West London Witch Patreon, there is an extra special additional interview with Chris, where I ask him the hard questions about his grandparents. This is a tough, no-holds-barred interview about the good, the bad, and the deeply controversial elements of Ed and Lorraine Warren. I commend Chris for his openness and candor as I ask him to confront some deeply uncomfortable claims about his grandparents. This is an interview you do not want to miss. Lastly, I'd like to thank Chris for taking the time to share this story with all of us here at the West London Witch. Unlike his grandparents, Chris does not seek out the limelight. So I am truly grateful that I've had the opportunity to share his story here on the West London Witch. Do you have a spooky story you'd like to share? I'd love to hear it. Drop me an email at thewestlondonwitch@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Facebook at The West London Witch. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. And come and follow us for additional content on Instagram and Facebook. Until next time, merry meet, merry part, and merry meet again. The West London Witch is created by me, Rebecca Strazina. Our sound designer and production magician is the incredible Danny Cross. Our theme music was bespokely written and performed by the wickedly talented Kyle Hall. Our cover art is the beautiful collaboration between Lizzie Wilson and Jake Bowser. Special thanks to Miss Sinead Bowers, our quality control and biggest cheerleader. And thank you to you, all of our listeners all over the world. These are your stories. Thank you for sharing them with us.